Bienvenidos to the 34th convention of the Mexican International Studies Association. Bienvenidos al 34º Congreso de la Asociación Mexicana de Estudios Internacionales. And this morning we have a wonderful keynote lecturer. She is Professor Pinar Bilgin, and I am going to read her bio. So Pinar Bilgin is Professor of International Relations at Bilkent University, Ankara, Turkey, and an associate member of the Turkish Academy of Sciences. She has held visiting positions at the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington, D.C., at King's College London, Center for Resolution of International Conflicts, at the University of Copenhagen, Center for Contemporary Middle East Studies at the University of Southern Denmark, Amsterdam, Center for the European Studies at the University of Amsterdam, and the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. She is the author of many journal articles and books in the field of critical security studies, including Regional Security in the Middle East, A Critical Perspective, 2005, second edition 2019, so brand new almost. The International in Security, Security in the International 2016, and is co-editor of Routledge Handbook of International Political Sociology. With Javier Guillaume in 2017, and Asia in International Relations on Thinking Imperial Power Relations. She is an associate editor of International Studies Quarterly and previously served as associate editor of Security Dialogue and of International Political Sociology, an editorial board member of the journals ID, International Dialogue, Global Discourse, Security Dialogue, Contexto Internacional, International Studies Quarterly, Revista Brasileira de Política Internacional, Foreign Policy Analysis, International Political Sociology and Geopolitics, and an international editor advisory board member of the journals Millennium, Journal of International Relations, Perceptions. She is the co-editor of the Palgrave book series, Critical Security Studies in the Global South. She is currently president of the World International Studies Committee of the WISC. So Professor Bilgin, it is an honor for the Mexican International Studies Association to have you here this morning. She is going to talk about how not to globalize IR. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for this very kind introduction. Thank you also for the opportunity to be here with you today. The title of my talk, as announced, is how to or how not to globalize IR. And that title may come across as counterintuitive, I understand, right? It is widely recognized that our field of international relations need globalizing. And we need all the help that we can get in globalizing international relations. So why is it that I'm being critical of potential allies in this endeavor, right? Some may think that it is counterproductive to be critical of alienate fellow travelers on the path to globalizing IR. Well, my concern here is that some of our approaches that locate themselves as part of this effort of globalizing IR may be actually offering to produce knowledge that is likely to be counterproductive. That's the point that I'll try and make today, which is morning for you and the late afternoon for me. Right. Globalizing IR, I'm going to suggest to you, is not only about being more open to scholars with postcode different to ours, postcodes outside of North America and Western Europe, right? That includes many of us in this virtual conference room. Globalizing IR is also, and perhaps more so, about opening up IR international relations to approaches shaped by different outlooks, right? Different epistemological and ontological outlooks, so that the study of international relations would better reflect how the international is understood and practiced in different parts of the world. Okay, so the way I understand and practice globalizing international relations, it is not about only including others. It is about identifying and addressing our limitations as scholars interested in the international, right? Not only about opening up to others, but making international relations a better account of the international, right? So the idea is not to replace one form of parochialism with another form of parochialism, right? But all kinds of parochialism I understand to be counterproductive to our efforts. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'll begin by taking a quick overview of efforts to address IR's limitations. The term global IR was offered by Amitabh Acharya in his presidential address to the International Studies Association already some years ago, and many may not have actually heard of earlier efforts before 2014. Such efforts have actually a longer history, going back to the 1990s discussions on opening up international relations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that longer body of, broader body of efforts. And then the second thing that I'm going to do today is to identify Eurocentrism as our challenge, right? So what I'll do is I'll distinguish between three different dimensions of Eurocentrism, different, nevertheless interrelated. And then finally, I will discuss two different ways of responding to this challenge. One of them is so-called non-Western international relations, non-Western IR. And the second one is the study of constitutive outside. And I will say why I prefer one over the other. So that's our plan for the day. Now, before I begin by discussing the efforts of critical scholars who've been working on this for more than 30 years now, efforts to globalize international relations, let me go through the arguments of those who are against this effort, right? So who actually see no need whatsoever to globalize international relations, the so-called skeptics, right? I will then use the skeptics idea as a foil for discussing the points advanced by the critics who want to globalize IRs. Okay, so the skeptics ask, why open up international relations? Why globalize international relations? They would acknowledge that our academic discipline may have originated and flourished in Western Europe and North America, but they would insist that this is merely an accident of history, right? And that therefore it is not consequential. It does not have consequences for our knowledge about world politics. It's an accident of history. It just happened to have originated in one part of the world. So there is no need, such skeptics argue, to open up international relations, because the production of knowledge, they would say, is not about geography, is not about location, but it's about proper training. Okay, and those who are hailing from outside would soon become leading theorists if they receive similarly proper training about international relations. Now, 2 points to make about this. On the one hand, scholars from outside North America and Western Europe, some of them may be actually in this room, right? Scholars from outside North America and Western Europe are already leading theorists, even defined narrowly in terms of proper training. Okay. A narrow understanding of proper training. But this does not really sustain the skeptics' claim that this skeptics' claim, which rests on what I consider to be dated understandings of knowledge production. Okay, because knowledge is not independent of the context it responds to. It's not independent of the geographical and historical and political context it responds to. It is evolving with it. In the 20th century, IR was shaped around concerns securing the global reach of a declining great power, that is Britain, after the First World War, and later a rising great power, that is the United States, in the aftermath of the Second World War. This is the context in which IR was developing. This is the world that IR was responding to, right? So these conditions did not only shape international relations as we know it, but also limited what we know about world politics. So when in 1977, Stanley Hoffman declared international relations to be an American social science, he did not only underline how the US context and US interests shaped the academic discipline, but he was also pointing to its limitations, right? This was not a celebration of American social science. He was also being critical of it. So, you know, I don't know about you, but sometimes it pays off to go back and reread some of these frequently referred texts, such as that of Hoffman. So what we understand by proper training is a product of a particular moment in time, and place, right? So the point that I'm making here is not in favor of or against social scientific endeavor, but it's against the narrow conception of such endeavor, right? That we need to pay attention to the context that knowledge production responds to, that international relations has originated and flourished in Western Europe and North America is not inconsequential for our knowledge about world politics, say statehood, sovereignty, or security, right? So to talk about proper training as such implies that critical approaches do not offer proper training, but also reflects dated understandings of knowledge production that some other branches of social sciences actually have left long behind, right? So, but let's remember, it's not just it's not just those who have a narrow conception of science who are critical of the efforts to globalize international relations. Some of our IR colleagues who do not otherwise subscribe to such outdated notions, understandings of knowledge production, may also not see a need to globalize or open up international relations. They would argue that, yes, IR may be an American social science, as Hoffman put it, but they would say international relations has since gone global, right? But then when they make such points, I think it's important to clarify perhaps what we mean by global here. What is true is that international relations teaching and research spans the globe. It is organized under political science in some places, or organized under separate IR departments in other places. In Turkey, we have separate international relations departments. In the UK, where I received some of my postgraduate training, well, it claims itself to be the credits itself to be the first international relations department in the world abreast with, right? You have separate IR departments, and in other contexts, we have them organized under political science. So you can tell me about how it works in Mexico. Another discipline, another sign of our discipline becoming being more globalized is that students are around the world are trained using the same English language textbooks or local translations of this. Yet another sign of this is that annual meetings of the International Studies Association consistently attract more than 5,000 researchers from around the globe. Sometimes we attend the ISA to meet each other, for scholars from different parts of the world, right? World International Studies Committee is made up of such regional and local associations of international relations, right? So the claim that IR has already gone global has some backing here, that it is embraced by students and scholars around the world, right? But then this does not really, the fact that IR has gone global in terms of its reach may not be enough to remedy the constitutive effects of its origins in North America and Western Europe, right? That IR has gone global in terms of its reach may not really be enough to remedy its constitutive effects in terms of its origins. This is a point that was originally made by E.H. Carr, who pointed out that the study of world politics reflected the perspectives and concerns of what he called the mighty, right, at the time. And he said this state of affairs was not going to be sustainable in the long run, right? That it was bound to change as powers rise and decline. He at the time advised, this is Carr, right? He at the time advised that the less powerful would soon begin to make their voices heard in world politics, as well as the study of world politics. Okay, this was his expectation at the time. In the early 1980s, KJ Holsty echoed Carr, right? And he invited students of international relations to take stock of the field and see who does the theorizing, he asked. Because the problem of what kind of theories, I'm quoting Holsty here, we used to understand and explain the world of international politics, he said, is not divorced from who does the theorizing. And we should expect, again, right? He has the similar expectation as that of Carr. We should expect, he said, serious challenges to come from those who did not share these experiences or have experienced them differently. Okay, so Carr is a historian who's embraced by realism in international relations, and KJ Holsti is no critical IR scholars, but both were cognizant of the constitutive effects of historical and political context for knowledge production. Okay, let's make a note of this. More recently, more critical sociological approaches to international relations took stock of the international relations teaching and research around the world. And they also found that they've done more systematic studies. And these systematic sociological studies of international relations scholarship around the world showed us that there is a slant towards certain institutions in North America and Western Europe in terms of knowledge production. And course syllabi, what we use to train our students, course syllabi in North America and Western Europe, they found, seldom include scholarship produced in other parts of the world. Very seldom include scholarship produced in other parts of the world, right? Unless, you know, they are about area expertise, right? Sometimes not even about that. What is also interesting, we found out, is that Global South seems to pay heed to IR as studied in North America and Western Europe in terms of teaching, right? That we often include produce of North America and Western Europe, but it does not work the other way around. Okay. In terms of the research that we do, the picture seems to be more complicated in terms of the knowledge that we're producing in the Global South. In the surface, and this is actually documented in Arlene Tickner and Ulla Weber's 2009 book, IR Scholarship Around the World, scholarly publications seem to bear surface resemblance to IR scholarship elsewhere, but the substance takes forms that are surprising, right? They're not entirely familiar. So surface resemblance, but the substance takes in unfamiliar forms. There are things that are very interesting and very useful to look into. Right. This is something that I have actually worked on in the past, right? That scholarship in different parts of the world may look the same, but not quite. This is a wordplay on Homi Baba's work. So if you're interested in this point, I'm happy to come back to it, but I'm going to move on in the interest of time. Okay, so I'm closing a parenthesis here. I was talking about complex findings regarding how IR looks like outside of Western Europe and North America. And dealing with this challenge turned out to be more difficult than it was initially imagined. Remember, initially it was imagined that we would open up international relations. Carr expected this to happen. KJ Holsti expected this to happen. But by the time we got to the 2000s, early 2000s, students of international relations increasingly realized that this was this is a challenge, in that it is not only about asking ourselves who does the theorizing and inquiring sociologically into the answer, but also paying attention to what they say, right? Not only asking who does the theorizing, but also paying attention to what they have to say. And what they have to say, they meaning scholars from outside North America and Western Europe, turned out to be sometimes equally Eurocentric, right? Turning to scholarship outside North America and Western Europe may not always produce IR that is less Eurocentric in the study of world politics. This was not really something that was expected, but this is what we found increasingly. Okay. Now I think it's a good time to clarify for me to explain what I mean by Eurocentrism. Now that I suggested that scholarship from outside Western Europe and North America may also be Eurocentric. Oftentimes the criticism of Eurocentrism is thrown around without specifying what is meant, so I'll try to avoid that. But let me just very quickly wrap up what I've said so far. I have said that there are two related findings offered by scholars who have underscored the need for opening up or globalizing IR scholarship. Sociological studies, I have said, right, revealed the field to be not so international, Ulla Weber's words. which means that scholars from North America and Western Europe are not always well represented in scholarly publications or course syllabi. The second finding is that international relations understanding of the world is not so is not so sociological. I'm quoting Stephen Chan here. Our existing body of scholarship does not sufficiently reflect how things are not only different, but how things also mix. So the point about globalizing IR is about both acquiring insight into our differences, right, and implications of such differences for our understanding of the international. Not only understanding our differences, but also inquiring into the implications of such differences for the study of the international. And that such differences can't really be explained away with reference to access or not to proper training, right? This is something that needs to inquire into by treating for those who are coming outside North America and Western Europe as thinking actors, paying attention to what they say, okay? Paying attention to what they say. So what I understand by Eurocentrism here is not about geography. You may have already guessed that, right? Eurocentrism of IR is often reduced to geography alone. But I have already, and you may have noted that I've just identified the founders of IR hailing from institutions in Western Europe and North America, and suggested that this has had consequences for our understanding of world politics. But reducing Eurocentrism to this, right, to the centrality of the roles played by individuals and institutions inside of North America and Western Europe, actually is impoverishing for our understanding of its persistence. Reducing Eurocentrism to geography is impoverishing for our understanding of its persistence. And it does not really allow us to understand its full implications. We need a more comprehensive understanding of Eurocentrism. Here I'm joining others. This is not, you may recognize that there's a whole tradition of being critical of not only in international relations, but also in history and political science and beyond. Samir Amin's groundbreaking work comes to mind. What I'm going to do is I'll distinguish between three dimensions of Eurocentrism in the study of world politics, and try and identify the implications of those. I'll start with the most obvious dimension of Eurocentrism, that is the normative dimension. Normative Eurocentrism is easiest to recognize, actually. We observe it when scholars put Europe and its interests on top of their research agenda. Let me use an example from what I have studied in the past, the study of the Middle East. I'm quoting a historian of the 20th century. He was writing about the eve of the Second World War in the Middle East, right? A historian of the 20th century. When writing about the eve of the Second World War in the Middle East, he wrote the Middle East was secure, right? Just before the beginning of the Second World War. This is an instance of normative Eurocentrism in the sense that the Middle East was secured in so far as British interests in this part of the world were concerned, or US interests in this part of the world were concerned, right? And when we put British or US insecurities at the forefront of our analysis, this is normative Eurocentrism. Here, there is very little or no consideration of local actors' concerns, right? They were at the time suffering under mandate regimes in the Middle East, or suffering from unfair oil concessions in the Middle East. Okay, so it's normative in the sense that it privileges the interests and concerns over some over the others. And most clearly, not all of Orientalist literature is Eurocentric in this normative sense of the term. It privileges the interests and concerns of Europe over the others without often reflecting on its implications for the others. So that's for normative Eurocentrism. The second kind that dimension that I'm identifying is the methodological Eurocentrism. Okay, the methodological Eurocentrism has been explored by critical historical sociology scholarship, as well as international relations. I'm quoting Julian Gould's work here. He said, when research is designed in a way that occludes the global, right? does not really take into account the way in which we are connected in others in terms of our constitutive relations. By drawing a line, he says, from ancient Greece to Renaissance Europe to modern day West, with no sociological insight into connections. This is methodological Eurocentrism, he says. And what methodological Eurocentrism has done is that it has produced a particular narrative of Europe's place in history. And although we know that that narrative has its limitations, and we know that connected histories of the world are available, but these narratives are nevertheless allowed to design our research because of the persistence of concepts that are informed by the very same narratives. Our notions about state, for instance, our understanding of states development, our understanding of development, our understanding sovereignty, security, you name it, right? So these our understandings of these things are informed by this particular understanding of history, and then so to be utilized to make sense of other parts of the world as well. This critique is developed, as I said, in historical sociology, and also developed in historical sociologists in international relations. I'm thinking of the work of Sandra Halperin's work here. Let me use an example here. What IR scholars, critical IR scholars, have referred to as the myth of Westphalia, right, is not that sovereignty was exercised is only one part of the globe, right, and that it was exported to another part of the globe, right. That the myth is not that sovereignty was only exercised in one part, right. What is the myth here? So IR scholars have argued is that sovereignty has developed in only one part of the globe, devoid of connections to other parts of the globe. This losing sight of the connections is what they consider to be the myth of sovereignty in international relations. So what these scholars suggest is that methodological Eurocentrism limits us insofar as we are thinking about Eurocentrism as only limiting us in terms of our understanding of non-Europe, right? Africa, Southeast Asia, South America. Methodological Eurocentrism, they remind us, has implications for our understanding of Europe as well. So it actually has more radical consequences for all of us interested in world politics. It has limitations for our understanding of Europe because it severs us from our constitutive connectedness. I'll say a little bit more about this when I, toward the end, when I discuss two approaches to globalizing IR, this constitutive connectedness, these relationships. But let me just say something about this, the third dimension, as I promised. This third dimension of Eurocentrism is critical because this is the dimension that emboldens some, that makes allows some to offer their definitions of proper training as a yardstick for international relations scholarship to distinguish between those who are trained properly and those who are not trained properly. This is epistemological Eurocentrism. Right? This is the epistemological Eurocentrism, is the kind that allows for some to reject calls for opening up or globalizing international relations, suggesting that what we need is better training. Okay. These are what Walter Mignolo referred to as hierarchical patterns of epistemological hierarchical patterns of epistemic judgment, Walter Mignolo's words, right? And he says, you may be an empiricist or you may be an interpretivist, regardless of methodological choice, methodological orientation, hierarchical patterns of epistemic judgment limit us, he suggested. The example that he used here is the three worlds classification that originated in the 20th century. Classifying the world into first, second, and third worlds. This originates in the Cold War. The first world refers to the so-called free world. The second world refers to the socialist world, now gone. And the third world refers to what was then referred to as underdeveloped world, or nowadays more referred to as the developing world. Now, after the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we have come to realize that this classification has had actually effects in terms of knowledge production, what we know about different parts of the world. It has had consequences because the first world was approached in terms of science, the second world was approached in terms of ideology, and the third world was approached in terms of its culture, in terms of what they were contributing to the study of world politics in international relations, whereas the disciplinary approaches focus more on the first world. The area studies approaches were focusing mostly on the third world. So this definitely has had implications for what we know about the world, what we know about different parts of the world. Okay, and it has had implications for what we understand to be theory, right? Theoretical approaches to international relations as well. Now, I'm thinking about Amitav Acharya and Barry Buzan's question from 2007, when they asked, why is there no non-Western IR theory, right? This question is less about an absence of theorizing in other parts of the world, and more about our obliviousness, our lack of attention to, or lack of appreciation for scholars from outside Western Europe and North America as producers of knowledge. Our lack of appreciation for knowledge being produced outside, other than area studies knowledge, when we treat others as native informants for the kind of disciplinary work that we do in IR and political science, right? So this is not just in IR and political science, by the way, we see it in some other social sciences too, who gets to be treated as theorist, who gets to be recognized as producing theory versus not. This is also what Arif Dirlik pointed to when he was questioning the definition of theory that informs these debates. He asked, and I'm quoting here, how is it possible? Well, it is possible, he said, to reverse this question, right? Reverse this question, why is there no non-Western theory? He said it is possible to reverse this question and ask, why is it that the Chinese, not ask, why is it that the Chinese do not have theory that we have learned to produce, right? Why is it that they don't seem to want to produce theory that we do? And ask ourselves, why is it that we have theory and we do theory this way, right? His exact quote is, and ask not why Chinese do not have theory or do not seem to be willing to do theory like we do, and pretend that this is a failure, he said, and ask instead, why is it that we have theory and do theory in the way that we do? This requires reflexivity. Let's make a note of this, right? Not approaching others in terms of an absence, right? But turning to ourselves and questions our way of doing things. Okay, so I've identified three dimensions of Eurocentrism here. And I've underscored that Eurocentrism is multifaceted and can't be reduced to geography alone, right? It can't be identified in terms of locatedness, but we have to question the implications of such locatedness. We have to explore its implications in full, I have suggested. So what is at stake then in the debates on who does the theorizing? Remember, this is Holsty's question. Is not only inviting others to join the conversation, right? But also ask ourselves our own self-understanding regarding the constitution of the international and what constitutes theory and who constitutes a theorist. Ask ourselves. Okay, so that was the second part of the point that I'm building here. And finally, now I'm getting to my discussion on how to or how not to globalize international relations. So far, I have identified the dangers of parochialism, especially when it takes universalist forms, claim to know what theory is, who is a theorist. Now, I'll also say something about when such parochialism takes relativist forms as well. And such knowledge is referred to nowadays as non-Western international relations, so-called non-Western IR theorizing. And the point that I'm making then here is that this project of producing a non-Western IR closes down the avenues, the very avenues it is supposed to open, right? Non-Western IR, I'm suggesting, closes down the very avenues it is supposed to open. This is what I meant by some approaches to global IR being counterproductive in terms of what we actually want to achieve with globalizing international relations. And then I will end by introducing another way of doing this, the study of constitutive outside. That is going to be my conclusion. Now, here I'm identifying non-Western IR as a project because scholars who are interested in this, who are identifying with this, have decisively set out to build a school of their own. So there is some project, some movement around this. Acharya and Buzan's question from 2007 did not give rise to such efforts, but definitely fed into them, created a conducive context for such schools to be built. But the problem I identify here is that such efforts reduce Eurocentrism to geographical location, right? And therefore underestimate the persistent limitations of Eurocentrism for international relations. What happens here is that those who are seeking to produce a non-Western IR do not seek to challenge narratives on state, say, or development or sovereignty or security, right? What they say is one of two things. One of the things that they say is, if you have developed this, we have developed that, right? You have done this, we have done that. Or takes another form and says, we have developed this before you did, right? So we have discovered this before you have done that, or we have discovered, you have discovered this and we have discovered that. And I'm going to give an example of this. I know this is rather abstract. What they don't seem to be interested in doing is the constitutive connectedness of these said discoveries. This is something that Immanuel Wallerstein, as early as the 1990s, was critical of, right? Immanuel Wallerstein cautioned against such approaches, and he wrote about them in terms of anti-Eurocentric Eurocentrism, anti-Eurocentric Eurocentrism. He was here talking about the efforts of those who seek to identify traces of progress and modernization outside of Europe, without, he said, often failing to recognize that those very notions of what constitutes progress, right, those very notions of what constitutes modernity are shaped by the very same understanding of history, right? And an understanding of history, he said, that fails to recognize the contributions of others who were also part of the production of the very same things, right? So to say, I have done this, you have done that, right? Or I have done this before you do, does not always acknowledge how we have contributed to, not necessarily in equal terms, but how we have all contributed to the production of the very things that we're talking about. Right, and the problem with non-Western IR is that it underestimates the kind of constitutive connectedness that we have over the years. So it underestimates the implications of Eurocentrism in its counter to Eurocentrism, especially I suggest the methodological and epistemological dimensions of Eurocentrism, right? Let me put this more starkly, and non-Western IR, I suggest, leaves standing the Eurocentric edifice of international relations, right? What it challenges, its claim to relevance across space. So they say Eurocentric IR may be relevant in Europe, North America, Western Europe and North America, but it's not relevant for the rest of us. Okay, so it does not really have a point to make about the limitations of IR in general. Disciplinary IR only talks about its limitations in other parts of the world, whereas as a student of international relations, I would actually want to speak about international relations as a discipline, as opposed to just its relevance to other parts of the world as well. And this is what also we learned from the more critical approaches, historical, sociological approaches, as I was talking about a moment ago. So where do we go from here? The kind of approach that I find helpful is developed by David Blaney and Naim Inayatullah in a 2008 piece. They talk about studying constitutive outside of international relations, the constitutive outside of international relations. So not adding another body of thinking to our knowledge about the international without leaving it untouched, but studying its constitutive outside. This is a notion that was introduced by Stuart Hall, cultural theorist. Timothy Mitchell, political theorist, has also made use of this concept, and international relations, I'm relying on Blaney and Inayatullah's work. So this is an approach that seeks to make sense of the ideas and experiences of those who are also constitutive of the international, right? They also have played in the making of ideas and institutions that we understand that is the international, but they're outside in the sense that they do not make it into our narratives, okay? They're constitutive in terms of our ideas and institutions, but they're outside in that our textbooks do not talk about them. That's what they mean by constitutive outside. So their ideas of experiences have shapes, this or that, sovereignty, modernity, democracy, war, right? But they're outside in that our narratives about international relations don't talk about them. Okay, so there's a contradiction here, right? A constitutive outside points to a contradiction, and it is a contradiction that is actually central to our efforts to globalize international relations. This is a contradiction that is not to be resolved. We can't really get rid of this contradiction. We can only acknowledge that there is a contradiction here, there's a tension here, and then think through this contradiction, right? Because those who are outside are not just physically outside North America and Western Europe, but they are outside because they're left outside of our narratives on world history and our narratives on the international. Now, recent scholarship on global history has been increasingly been attentive to our connected histories, but they have mostly looked at the material connectedness between different parts of the world, right? So material contributions of, say, the Chinese or the Indians or the Arabs, among others, are acknowledged. I'm thinking of John Hobson's work here, for instance, The Eastern Origins of Western Civilization, 2004 book. Self-other dynamics are also noted, right? To European self versus non-European other. What is seldom made reference to is the ideational connections between Europe and other parts of the world. So Frans Fanon, for instance, is referenced, is having argued that Europe, he says, literally is the creation of the third world. But this is understood mostly in terms of material resources, including labor, for instance, or precious resources, right? But not in terms of ideas and institutions, right? Whereas more recently, critical IR scholarship have actually pointed to such connections that include material resources, of course, but not limited to those. Here I'm thinking about Siba Growogi's work, right? He has argued on the study of state failure, in quotation marks, state failure. He has argued that the emergence of apparently resilient states in Europe, and he uses the example of Belgium in his work. This is an EJRR article from 2006. The emergence of resilient states in Europe, such as Belgium, he says, and the so-called failed states in non-Europe, such as Congo, can't really, he says, be independent of each other, right? The emergence of resilient states in Europe and failing states in non-Europe can't be understood independent of each other. And this is not just about the more obvious relationship of colonial relationship, right, between Belgium and Congo. It is also, he says, about the international society, right? Not just colonial, imperial relations, material usurpation, remember, colonial direct and indirect rule, but it's also because of the rest of the international society, because he says international society treated these states differently, okay? Not just the colonial relationship between the two, but the rest of the international society, because international society, he points to, he underscores, were treating these states differently. And this international society's treatment, he said, allowed for the resilience of these European states, whereas undermined the sovereignty of some African entities, or even assisted in the failure of some others, right? This is the international society's treatment of states differently. There is a role here for international law. There's a role to be identified in terms of the international law, but it goes also beyond this as well. And there are several examples of this. Siba Grobodi talks about the relationship between, colonial Africa and colonizing European powers, but it can go, I can use Middle Eastern examples if you're interested in as well. Okay, so what's going on here is that it's not just our understanding of African states that suffer as a result of Eurocentrism here, when we sever our understanding of statehood, sovereignty, security outside of its connections, constitutive connectedness. Our understanding of statehood suffers, not just in Africa, but in the world at large, right? So we fail to make sense of the emergence of, say, Belgium in Western Europe, not just Congo in Africa. Our notion of state suffers in general, not just African state suffers as a result of this. So I'm just going to reiterate my point and wrap up here. The challenge of Eurocentrism for international relations is not only a geographical location related issue, it's also an issue of who produces knowledge, and the implications of who has produced knowledge, an epistemic problem. So if we approach Eurocentrism only in terms of geographical locatedness, we're misdiagnosing the challenge. We're diagnosing the challenge only in terms of an absence, right? So-called absence of non-European international relations narratives. And the solution then becomes one of decentering existing narratives or adding new so-called local perspectives, non-IR perspectives. And in contrast, if we understand the challenge of Eurocentrism as an epistemic problem, then we're problematizing the system of knowledge itself. So we're thinking about international relations in general, not our knowledge about international relations in this part of the world or that part of the world only. So what is missing is not non-Europe, right? The problem here is not the absence of non-Europe, but that non-Europe is present in a very particular way without appreciating its contributions. It overlooks its contributions and the role it's played in the development of our ideas, right? And you may think that, well, we already know about these things, especially those who are sensitive to historical accounts or area studies accounts. You may say that we already know about these things. Yes, we do, but let's also acknowledge that this kind of knowledge does not always get to inform our conceptual, theoretical studies of state sovereignty and development, whereas we need to make use of these insights to develop our concepts and theories too. This is not going to help us develop international relations so long as we keep these things separately. So the notion of constitutive outside, right, allows us to see that what is absent is not theorizing, right, but our failure to appreciate that others' ideas and institutions have already shaped our thinking about the international. So globalizing IR is not about opening up the field to contributions from outside, but considering the contributions and constatations of those who are outside, but they're recognizing at the same time that they're the constitutive outside, right? And I've identified non-Western IR as hampering such efforts. Globalizing IR, I have suggested to you, is about being open to approaches shaped by different epistemological and ontological outlooks, so that our study of international relations better reflects how the international is understood and practiced in different parts of the world. So we need a better international relations, I suggested, not another international relations. I'll conclude there, and I'm happy to elaborate on the different aspects and respond to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bilgin. It was a very interesting lecture about how not to globalize IR. You left us with a paradox on, okay, well, non-Western, it's going to just be a non-Western not read by Westerners, or we're going to be outside. So we have a very tough way ahead to go. Although I have to say that throughout the years, I've been able to also observe that, for instance, organizations like the ISA and others try to really open up to different points of view, and they have also, like we try to do here at the Mexican International Studies Association, to open more fora for non-Western points of view, also more submissions in the different journals. So I think we're going in the right direction. So maybe later on you can elaborate on a little bit of this, and maybe a way of how do we persuade Westerners to read our works, the works of non-Westerners, right? Because that seems to be a big problem. So right now we're open to Q&As. I am going to give the mic, because we can have a better interaction this way, to Professor Alberto Lozano. He is actually past president of the Mexican International Studies Association. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Dr. Bilgin, welcome to AME. It's great to have you here in Mexico, at least virtually. I have a couple of questions for you. The first one is, beyond mainstream Western IR approaches, and having in mind your contribution on the international insecurity and security in the international, what could be a first intuitive approach from you to the security problems of Mexico regarding the harmful activities of transnational organized criminals? In other words, how to approach to this transnational security problem from a non-core IR point of view. And the second question is, what could be a first step to begin theorizing from the Global South? A local problem-driven approach or a cultural-driven approach? Where to begin to theorize from the Global South without falling in parochialism? In Mexico, I live in the state called Oaxaca, in the South. So I live in the South of the Global South. I teach IR theory, but I don't theorize. Huge difference. So, in your opinion, where's a good start point to theorize beyond the West? Thank you.
Shall I take this question?
Sure, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Lozano, for two challenging questions, I have to say. I'll try and respond to them in the order in which you've asked them. One was about thinking about the problem of transnational organized crime and how to address this in a way that goes beyond our existing ways of studying such problems. Let me not touch upon the case that you have talked about, and let me limit myself to the part of the world that I know more about, and perhaps we can then elaborate on the parallels and the differences between the two. I have recently thought about and written about the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, right? This is not an issue of organized crime, but the issue of migration in terms of European Union security practices is often reduced to the problem of terrorism, right? Migrants are increasingly received more skeptically because of the potential of terrorists arriving in our territories. This is not always the case, but to a certain extent, the United States has also talked about migrants in terms of the problem of both organized crime and terrorism. So there is an affinity there, not a parallel, but there is an affinity there, treating migrants not as the problem of mobility as such, but in terms of its relationship to the transnational crime or transnational terrorism, non-state actors in world politics. Now, what this connected histories approaches to the past, the recent past in this case, not centuries ago, allows us to see is not to start from today, right? Not to start from where we are at this moment in time, but go a little back in history and look at the evolution of this problem in terms of our connections. Okay, so when we look at the problem of migration, for instance, and what the kind of problem it causes, it poses for Western Europe and the European Union in particular. Right, this is not independent of Western European, especially colonial powers, relationship to the south of the Mediterranean or the east of the Mediterranean. And I'm not really talking only about the colonial relationships, right? France's relationship with Morocco and Algeria, or relationship of Britain to Egypt, or or the mandate regimes in the Eastern Mediterranean. There is that, of course, but there is also widespread recognition of the colonial past. What I'm referring to here is the more recent history, that is a post-colonial history, right? And the relationships that North American, United States in particular, and Western European countries, I'm thinking about both the UK here, but also other NATO members here, have established with oil-producing states in the Middle East. Right? These are regimes, these are post-colonial regimes, the stability of which relies on the relationship that they have established with Western European, North American states. And the lack of democratic participation in these states, right, is to a certain extent owed to the outsiders' search for stability in this part of the world. Right. So when we take a more connected histories approach, to more constitutive outside approach to the study of, say, the problem of migration and it poses to Western Europe, is that these people do not really leave their homes and try and achieve different kind of livelihood in Western Europe only because they're seeking a better life, right? That's the traditional explanation to migration, but also because their homes have become difficult to live in. And that is not that kind of, if you want to call this failure, right? Remember Grobogi's work that I was talking about here. Such failure is not only to do with the failings of these countries or these regimes, independent of how they have established relationship with the rest of the world. And this is not only about international society, as Grobogi was talking about, it's also to do with the kind of oil economy that was set up in Second World War period, how important the regime stability of Saudi Arabia has been, for instance, for the rest of the world, and the deal that Saudi Arabia internally and internationally has struck with initially Britain and then with the United States. This is a very contemporary history, right? It is not about the colonial past, but these kinds of interconnections are often missed when we look at the problems as they are being as they are products of only this past 5 years, only these past 10 years or so. Hence, the importance of such approaches to be able to understand our very contemporary problems. So the approach that I'm suggesting here is, and I've written about this as well, I'm drawing here from Edward Said's work, contrapuntal history. That is, that is a method that he has developed in the study of comparative literature, but it is adopted by international relations scholars too. So that's my attempt to answer the first question. To make sense of the contemporary problems by making use of these alternative approaches, not theories, but alternative approaches to the international. Where to begin without falling into the danger of being parochial ourselves? The key here is and there's been some writing and thinking around this recently. The key here is reflexivity, and other scholars have written about this as well. So we being critical of ourselves as we try and address others' limitations, right? Not to approach these limitations only in terms of the problems of IR as it is produced in North America and Western Europe, but also turn to ourselves and look at our own limitations as well. And the very question that you asked, Professor Lozano, actually suggests that it is a reflexive question, right? In the attempt to criticize others' parochialism, we need to watch out against our own parochialism. So you know, you're already one step ahead than compared to some of our international relations colleagues. That is I understand that is the key here, not to replace IR with another IR, but to work towards making our understandings of international relations better.
Thank you very much, and welcome again.
Thank you very much.
Now I have another question. I have two other participants who would like to ask a question. First, I'm going to read a question from Sarela Lopez. Which are the limitations of people in the IR community in a contemporary international system which is strongly globalized? And after that, I'll give the mic to Professor Kakowicz to ask his question.
Is this first one written? May I? Okay. Well, it needs translating. So do you mind reading
Sure,
it again?
I'll repeat. Which are the limitations of people in the IR community in a contemporary international system which is strongly globalized?
Okay. I'll try and respond in a way that I understand. I may have misunderstood the question. What we mean by IR community that is already globalized, and this is my understanding of IR having globalized, is that our study of international relations is not independent of IR as having developed in North America and Western Europe. As I said, you know, I studied international relations in a university that was modeled after US universities. It was one of the earliest departments of international relations here in Turkey. And currently I teach at a university that is also modeled after US universities. So, you know, we are producing international relations in a world that is already globalized. This is my understanding of the question. Again, as I said, I may have misunderstood this. Of course, there are limitations here, right? We are shaped by what we're told, right? Even when we're not really having studied, even if we haven't studied in, say, in the UK or in the United States, we are shaped by international relations as having evolved over the years. But keep in mind that we are not just what we're taught. Okay, we are not just what we're taught. We're also responding to what we have thought. And the kind of international relations training that I have received has not really limited me. Of course, it has shaped me and it has limited me. Yet at the same time, it also allowed, among others, me, to be reflective on the kinds of limitations of international relations. But, and also keep in mind that, you know, this kind of reflexivity is something that I have also learned how to develop when I was studying in the United Kingdom, right? So this kind of sensitivity, there is a limitation here, of course, but this kind of sensitivity I have also learned when I was located in Western Europe. Remember, I said there are paradoxes here that are involved. Right? There are no easy answers. If I had studied only in Ankara to study international relations, perhaps I would have never questioned the kind of international relations training I received. Right? I learned how to question the limitations when I went into a place that was critical of international relations knowledge production here as well. So there are limitations here, of course, but keep in mind that we are very much able to reflect on our limitations. We could be trained to reflect on our limitations and try and go beyond that as well. And sometimes we'll receive that training also in North America and Western Europe. This is not about what Europe versus non-Europe, West versus non-West. There are those who are critical in both contexts.
Thank you very much. Now I will give the mic to Professor Ari Kakovic to state his common question.
Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yeah.
Un placer estar aquí, Jessica, en este congreso. Pinar, a pleasure to see you. I wrote you that question, and I really love what you said. I mean, it was really interesting, but the question is, this criticism of Eurocentrism, isn't this a bit binary, like either or? You quote Kalevi-Holsti. I think Karl Holsti also referred to let's leave 1,000 flowers bloom. And I wanted to share with you and with all our Mexican colleagues here my own experience as a graduate student in the United States. The first time I learned about dependencia, desarrollo, dependency and development in Latin America, which is a great book by Cardoso and Faleto, was in a seminar taught by Robert Gilpin. And Robert Gilpin taught us in 1988 that this was a great contribution to IR theory, right? So isn't this idea of, it's either or counterproductive? And I think I learned from Gilpin about dependencia because in Argentina before that, it was forbidden and, and it's a great contribution, dependency school to IR theory.
No, thank you, Ari. Thank you for asking this question. That's what I was sort of building towards in my response to the earlier question as well. Had I not been too abreast with to study international relations, perhaps if I'd only stayed in Ankara to study international relations, I wouldn't have learned how to be critical of these kinds of approaches as well. So it's not either or, definitely not. That's why I find the global South notion more productive in terms of our thinking about the limitations of international relations, in the sense that global South is not only to the south of the world, right? The global South locations may also exist in terms of knowledge production, not only just material production, but also knowledge production in other parts of the world as well. When they asked Cardoso during the 1970s, how is it, they ask him, that your approach is embraced in the United States? One of his responses, this is not a direct quote, I'm paraphrasing him, he says, well, there are southern locations in the United States, so this is perhaps a better way of making sense of those, making sense of the condition of those southern, not the south of the United States, right, but the global South in the global North. That's what he is referring to, as I understand it. So my approach, this development of underdevelopment, he says, does not just explain the South of America, he said, but the global South in general. Sometimes we mistake the southern hemisphere for the global South, but that's not the origins of that concept. So yes, it allows us to go beyond this binary, both in geographical terms, in terms of material production, but also in terms of the production of ideas. When I made a presentation on this when I was in Amsterdam, I was also reminded of the Amsterdam school as well. They said, well, that's their understanding of international relations is all about political economy, and it's very different from these kinds of the so-called more mainstream approaches to international relations. So yeah, thank you for allowing me to elaborate on this very, very important point, Ari. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, let's go to the next question. So please, I give the mic to Eric Viramontes.
Thank you so much. And also thank you, Dr. Pinal, for this timely and I think very insightful presentation. I myself am developing a project that questions the search for pluralism in non-Western IR from a decolonial perspective. And this project started on the invitation to a workshop by the Ibn Khaldun Center of Qatar University. So I was wondering, in light with the arguments that I'm developing myself, that what would you think of not considering necessarily the field of non-Western IR as a monolithic kind of project that leads to one direction only, but the necessity to being able to recognize different projects and different perspectives within the field or the subfield of non-Western IR. In this sense, non-Western IR would become a subfield within the discipline, where many projects will converge. And I think myself that there are many projects within non-Western IR that actually resonate with the colonial arguments. Here I'm thinking about the project of The Plurality of Particulars by Peter Mandeville, who talks about this new spirit of cosmopolitanism, and also Robbie Schillem's quest and to generate an interpretive framework for non-Western international thought that deals with modernity from different perspectives. So I was wondering how necessary it is to recognize the non-Western as a subfield rather than a single and monolithic project on the one hand. And on the other, I was also wondering, and I agree with you, that the problem is not very much to recognize the willingness or to have this willingness to listen to the other. It's not about being willing or not willing to listen and to include the ignored voices, but rather the problem is, from my perspective, how these voices are listened to. How do we read non-Western thought? Because the West, non-West is a positionality, right? Me, myself, can be a Western or a non-Western at the same time. So what do you think about the quest for universal knowledge as hindering the very quest to bring pluralism into the field of IR? Whether or not we should question this quest for universal knowledge. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you. That's what Professor De Alba was also getting at when she was asking, how do we get Western scholars to read what we write, right? That's also part of the question. Thank you for these two questions. I'd be very interested in finding out about the kind of work that you're doing. So please let me know. Right. What I mean by Western IR is a particular aspect of knowledge production. So here I'm not really referring to Robbie Schillem's work or Peter Mandeville's work. I'm familiar with both of their work. I actually would not consider them as part of the project of non-Western IR in the sense that they're not seeking to produce another set of knowledge about the international. They're actually working within IR to criticize international relations. I know Robbie's book talks about non-Western intellectuals, right? But the very insight that he provides there is about our connections, our constitutive relations, as opposed to disconnect, which is what we get from. Mostly I have here in mind the Chinese school of international relations, which is pointing to disconnects and has the risk of producing a parochial perspective on world politics. So that's, I have a very narrow definition of what I'm critical of here, and it would not really include all efforts coming, I would say, from the global south. I wouldn't call it non-Western efforts coming from the global south to produce knowledge about international relations. So let me clarify that. I'm a big fan of both Robbie Schillem and Peter Mandeville's work in that regard. And Peter has done a lot of work on this, starting from the very early efforts. So I'd like to acknowledge that as well. Right. The second question that you're asking is also what I was trying to get at when I was talking about, it's not only about who does the theorizing, right, but what they have to say, right, and whether we are actually going to pay attention to what others have to say about world politics. And there is an important difficulty here, right? There is sometimes more of an openness to what others have to say if they have something radical to say about international relations, right? The so-called radicals get listened to if they have something that is entirely different to say about world politics, whereas sometimes those who are not coming up with radically different approaches also have insights to make about world politics. This is something that I have actually tried to elaborate on. The surface similarities to IR knowledge, but do not need to be studied. I have suggested to reveal the substantive differences between the two. So we may be working with the same categories of state and sovereignty and security. We may not be necessarily coming up with alternative approaches to them, but the way we theorize about them, the way we operationalize them, the way we make use of them actually reveal very different ways of approaching them at the same time. So that's what I mean by paying attention to what they've got to say, not only who does the theorizing, but what they say. And this is perhaps similar to what you're suggesting by how these voices are listened to, right? There is some openness to more radical voices, right, as opposed to talking to colleagues who seem similar to us, but different in very unexpected ways. I'd be very interested in having a conversation about this. So let's try and keep in touch about this. I'd be interested in working about your work as well. Thank you very much.
Now I am going to take the last question, so because we still have 5 minutes, so let's take advantage. So it is from Edith Rubalcaba, and she says, thank you, Dr. Bilgin, for giving light to such an important issue in our discipline, such as questioning where theoretical statements come from. In your point of view, do labels such as the Global South can help us overcome the Eurocentric vision of IR by joining efforts and bringing light to other realities, or on the contrary, can lead to a grouping of the West and the rest, and thus by default lead us to a label result such as international knowledge, which is produced by the West, and local knowledge, which is produced by the Global South, for example. I think you have touched upon those issues already.
Okay, thank you. This is also very helpful in terms of clarifying some of the issues that I was trying to get at. When we categorize knowledge in terms of European, non-European, or Western, non-Western, we're finding ourselves, we're severing ourselves from the connected histories of the production of ideas. So they're not helpful in that sense, right? We're severing ourselves from the histories of connected histories of the production of those ideas. So they are counterproductive in that sense. We all make use of it, right? But many of us have actually moved away from them. So nowadays I'm more inclined to make use of the notion of the Global South. But remember, I was reminding myself, not just you, but also myself, in response to Professor Arikakovich's question, that Global South needs to be also, we need to remember that the notion of Global South comes from an effort to think differently about the world, right? There is a periphery at the center, as well as a center at the periphery, right? So there may be those who belong to who are closer to the center in terms of their interests, their insecurities at the center of Nigeria, right? And there may be those in the United Kingdom or in the United States who have insecurities and concerns more similar to the South in those North countries. So we need to remember that the Global South is not about the Southern Hemisphere. It's not a replacement for the third world, right? It does not replace the third world. It is really not helpful if we think of the Global South as a replacement, as a more neutral, or as a more 21st century replacement, a conceptual replacement for the third world. The notion of Global South initially was offered to actually go beyond these territorial, go beyond these geographical understandings of categories, and to make sense of center in the periphery and periphery in the center, the third world in the first world and the first world in the third world, if you wish. But when we think about the Global South in those terms, right, they come very helpful. When we don't, then we are bound to replicate the mistakes of the past, and we're bound to stay within the limitations of, say, non-Western theorizing, right, or third world theorizing, etc. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. I think we have reached the end of your magnificent conference. We took a lot with us. Thanks again for being here in the Mexican International Studies Association convention, and we hope to meet with you again.
Hopefully, yes. Thank you very much for this opportunity.